preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Now, last evening, at the end of the evening, some people had pointed out that the mic wasn't picking up my voice consistently, and they had some trouble following it. If any of you in the back can't hear, would you please be good enough to raise your hand? They have raised the mic since, and I think there'll be no problems. My voice is a little hoarse. If it was bad last week, it might be worse, though I think there shouldn't be any difficulty. Now, this is the second in a series of 5 lectures called Philosophy of Values, in which the idea is neither a very complicated nor a very original one. We want in 4 of these lectures to discuss areas of human experience in which people have usually found some sort of ultimate significance or value. One such area has been history itself, the study of human activity and the attempt to construct a theory of history which would show significance and end and purpose in human activities. A second such area is clearly religion. A third such area is scientific activity. A fourth such area, artistic activity. And then the concluding lecture, we want to try to generalize some questions about the previous 4. Tonight, then, the topic is, as formulated in the program, the adequacy of religion. And this is in some ways a sort of nervy title. Let's see what we can do about it. Obviously, we're concerned with the adequacy of religion as a source of some sort of claim that values can be justified. Let me explain in the most obvious way. It's notorious, isn't it, just by looking at value relativism, it's notorious, isn't it, that people conflict over value judgments. That for some people, let's even take within the domain of religion, the most ultimate and important thing may be the obedience of certain ritual commandments. That for others, the most ultimate and obedient thing may be the obedience of certain verbal formula. That for others, ultimate significance may be reverence for any living thing. So that, for example, in a variety of religions, the monkeys and the cows cannot be killed, even if human life is at stake. In others, of course, different sets of values may be operative. And the question we're asking in part is, how is there justification of these values in religion, particularly if these values conflict either among the historic religions or between religion and other claims? And yet, before we turn to this question, which can be posed another way, let me pose it very simply and then digress for a moment and come back to it. The question simply is this, posing it again. We live in a world of what I called a moment ago value relativism. One man's meat is another man's poison. What is accepted in one culture is rejected in another. We have been terribly sensitive to the fact of such ethical relativism. Usually, not always, usually religious claims argue that they justify one set of values which are ultimate, universal, and true. And the question we want to explore in part is, given this value relativism, given this situation in which there are so many different conflicting theories of what is good or what is right, what is ultimately good or ultimately right, or even partially good and partially right, can the religious justification function? Can it function to adequately justify a person in his value judgments, given awareness to the competing and conflicting value judgments which are present? There can be little doubt, I think, that historically religions have functioned for people as areas of ultimate significance in a variety of ways. Very, very often they function to develop levels of aspiration. And one can think of all sorts of religious utopias or of religious conceptions, whether of the city of God or of heaven or of other such more complex and more interesting creations, like Day of Judgment and so on, which offer people levels of aspiration, certain sorts of dreams, if you want, certain sorts of wish fulfillment, if you want, sometimes certain sorts of realistic ideal goals. And obviously, such a function is one of tremendous significance in human culture. Very, very often, these levels of aspiration are levels of inhibition. There can be no doubt that to provide a level of aspiration which inhibits some of the irrationality of man can sometimes, of course, be of great virtue. Religions have often, though we don't tend to think of this as so much, served as instruments of release, of catharsis. We don't tend to think of this because in our religious culture, Christian culture, even Jewish culture, the inhibiting factors and the aspiring factors are more significant. But there are a variety of Greek religions. The Dionysiac element in religion is always referred to, where religion functions notoriously as an element of release of passion, release of libidinal energies. Religion functions in this way, even in Judaism, I think, for example, notorious instance, the Day of Atonement and the use of the sacrificial scapegoat historically, where quite obviously release of guilt and some sort of catharsis of guilt is taking place through the fast day, through driving the goat off the cliff as an atonement for one's sins, and so on. And obviously, if the results of being guilt-ridden are notoriously bad, the functioning of religion as an instrument of release and catharsis is of great value. Then again, religions have functioned, especially in primitive cultures, relatively primitive cultures, as instruments of his scientific account. You see, we tend to think immediately of a conflict of science and religion because we live after the 16th century with the emergence of autonomous science and the emergence of an institutionalized religion. But surely in ancient culture, surely, for example, to the authors of the book of Genesis, when they wrote, when God began to create the heaven and earth and so on, the earth was chaos and the void, they were not doing religion as opposed to science. They were giving a likely account of their cosmogony, of the genesis of the world, and of their cosmology, of the structure of it as they saw it. The reference to the abyss, the reference to the waters of the deep, certain sort of recognition found, of course, in early Greek philosophy too, that the earth floats on the water, found in Egyptian mythology as well. The recognition of the presence of water, of the earth on the water, some sort of account, giving a rational, coherent account of the generation of stars, of planets, of animal life after that, of human life after that. It doesn't, of course, I'm not trying to maintain for a moment that it has the canons of experimental verification or of critical rationality, which a contemporary astrophysicist or contemporary physicist would have. But it is an attempt to give a likely account, a probable story of how the world came into being. In that sense, it represents, through religious writings, an attempt to both satiate, to satisfy, and at the same time to whet man's appetite, man's curiosity about the world in which he lives. And perhaps more than any of these, religion function, of course, is perhaps the most notorious area of human expressiveness, in the sense of expressiveness in the plastic and the poetic arts. I mentioned last week in connection with, just as an illustration, or I just tie it up because it was, I think it is an interesting illustration. I mentioned last week the paintings of the cavemen in Spain. And I suggested they painted bulls and bisons, and suggested something about in discussing why progress is not inevitable, that paintings, let's say, near there of bulls by Picasso, who's one of the, I suppose, the greatest painter of bulls in the 20th century, are not, in my opinion, better than the paintings of the cavemen, of these wonderful paintings in earth colors on the ceilings of the caves of the bulls and the bisons. But these paintings were apparently part of their religious expression, part of the incantation to capture the bull. And the priest would presumably call them around and go through some sort of symbolism or rite through the painting of this bull or bison, which would function partly magically to help the capture of the bull or the bison. That's hypothetical, but we need only think of society after society, including, of course, Hebraic society in the desert, when Bezalel is the craftsman of the religious objects, to know that we are dealing with an area of human activity and religious activity in which music, art, the plastic symbols, dance, and so on have continuously found an expression. So I say that in one sense, to raise the question of the adequacy of religion is so huge because religions function in all these different ways, both adequately and inadequately, for hundreds and thousands, and if we include the early prehistoric experience I referred to, even as much as tens of thousands of years. Its function to just repeat, I think, and suggest ways in which you could explore this further. It's functioned, as I said at first, providing levels of aspiration and therefore levels of inhibition, even to use a word which some people think a bad word, but which I think is a good word, levels of repression for human nature, levels of aspiration and inhibition. It's functioned, as I said, to give levels of release and catharsis. It's functioned to give to whet man's curiosity about the world in which he lives and give likely and coherent explanations and accounts, partially myth, partially based on observation of the world in which he lives. It's functioned again, as I just concluded, as an area of expressiveness of humans' awareness of their immediate environment through plastic senses, through visual senses, through musics and art and so on. But the question which I think most concerns us, the one with which I started and then gave this digression, is of course its adequacy in justifying human values. Here, of course, notoriously religion is served to say, given the plethora of human choices, of human preferences, of human alternatives, the religious commandment or the religious ideal or the religious expression is the necessary condition and the sufficient condition. It's the way in which you will know what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. It's functioned, therefore, crucially within Western European experience, within Jewish and Christian experience, as a justification of morality, the ideal type of man, the obligatory type of action. How adequate has it been here? Well, obviously it is motivated fantastic amount of human idealism, fantastic amount of moral activity, and of course led to such phenomena as religious wars and what Morris Raphael Cohn once called the dark side of religion. The dark side of religion. Those features of fanaticism, intolerance, superstition, even religious warfare, which have been characteristic, I think, of almost every religious tradition that one can mention. We're more interested, I think, in the theoretical aspects of this than in the actual historical ledger, counting up the good and the bad marks, showing the ways in which religion has fostered art, the way in which it's inhibited art, and so on and so forth. And when we turn to these theoretical questions, and I'm now going to explore them in historical context, I think we find 5 difficulties, and I'm going to go through each of these 5 and then come back and try to answer them and then summarize. The first, which I'm not going to say much about, but which is a troublesome one relative to ethics, is an internal one. Though religion always claims to be offering justifications of the good, there's a sense in which our moral sense itself re-examines the question. That sounds very abstract. It's very, very simple. Let's just think. We tend to ask ourselves the question, what is good? And you recall my context. The context was moral relativism. People don't know what's good. What's good in one society is bad in another society, or so it's said. And in that context, you ask again the question, what is good? And the religious answer, let's say, of a traditional religion is, what is the command of God, or what is revealed by God? The good is that which is revealed by God, or the command of God. And now, internally, this seems to raise a difficulty. Why? Because you immediately ask yourself this question, which is always formulated in a religious tradition of this sort. Is it good because God commanded it, or did God command it because it's good? If the 10 Commandments say, thou shalt not kill, is thou shalt not kill good because God commanded it? And if God had commanded killing, would killing then be good? Or is thou shalt not kill good because of some other thing, what I called a moment ago, our moral sense. And if God commanded the opposite, we would somehow say that's a false God, or that isn't the true voice of God. Well, the religious case, which is very, very difficult, is of course God's commanding the sacrifice of Isaac. And here, of course, you say, what happened here? God commands a man to sacrifice his only son. And this seems incredible. And yet it's good because it's the command of God. Well, the biblical story doesn't play it out all the way. At the last moment, the ram is substituted for Isaac. But what if the story ended with Isaac's sacrifice? Or take any other cases, and there are numerous ones in the history of religion, where human sacrifice has been used. The interesting question is, we tend to say yes, but if the religion is a true one, then the commands of God define what's good, and God's ways are not our ways. The Christian religion is, after all, based upon the mystery of God's sacrifice of his own son. It's Abraham, Isaac, sacrifice of the patriarch's son. And yet, very, very often we work the other way. We say, could this be the true word of God? Or would it have been? It had to be a false prophet. Hamlet, when he's told to kill his father's ghost, has this argument with himself. He says, I heard a voice. The voice I've heard may have been of the devil. Always, if the God says kill the son, you say it's a false prophet. It's not a genuine hearing. And the point is, we test whether something is the command of God by the very simple test of our own moral intuition. If it violates that moral intuition, we reject it as the command of God. But if this is the case, then religious ethics is in a dilemma. Why? A dilemma. Why? Because if it says on the one hand, anything is good which is the command of God, then it cannot use moral scruples against even the most abominable things if they are, within the religious tradition, the commands of God. And this, very often, if on the other hand you say, on the contrary, God's commands have to be tested by some sort of criterion of moral sensitivity or moral rationality, then you have abandoned the ultimate religious source. You have said not that something is good because God commanded it, but it is good and God commanded it. The moral source is not that it is the command of God. This is an internal difficulty within the religious justification of morality, and a very severe one. Let me turn to external ones. Viewed socioculturally, viewed within Western culture, within Western society, I suppose it's fair to say that religion functioned as the great cohesive element in morality up till the 17th century. Medieval religion, whether Jewish or general, received its moral source, its moral inspiration from the religious tradition. As a generalization, I think this is true. The gap between the theory and the ideal and the reality is something else. But nonetheless, the source of moral ideals was unquestionably, even for the feudal baron, even for the exploiting lord of the manor, the religious tradition. By the same token, I think, clearly in medieval culture, the great area of human vitality, the great architectural expressiveness of the Gothic cathedral, the great musical expressiveness of church music or synagogal music, the great release through the holiday cycle of the year was tied up with religious ritual, religious symbolism. That changed, I think, in the 17th century, predominantly because, or partially because, the 17th century was the great age, first age of scientific emergence. And here then we have the first question externally regarding the adequacy of religion as a source of ultimate significance for human culture, and it comes from the conflict or the rise of scientific activity. Now, much could be said about the conflict of science and religion. Let me just, before I make the point, make sure you see my sequence. I said I would discuss 5 issues regarding the adequacy of religious justification of values, or significance and ultimate concern of religious activity as an area of human activity. The first I mentioned was the internal difficulty within religious justification. The internal fact that the religious justification of ethics seems to say the good is anything which God commands, and yet tests God's command by a prior sensitivity to what is good. The second one that I'm now coming to is the conflict between science and religion. That conflict expresses itself in a variety of ways. One could list one after the other. Let me, I suppose, give three. Yes, I think three. The first is this. The religious sense in medieval culture, which gave man ultimate significance, was tied up to a certain conception of what the world was like. The world was the center of the universe. And Dante in the Inferno gives the most beautiful source. The universe is a small place. Jerusalem is its center. This earth is the center of the whole universe, and of course everything can be measured from it. If you go to Jerusalem, the center, and you start going down, you will come to hell. And every level you go will get colder and colder, and every level you go will correspond to some sort of moral failure. If you climb through somehow on the other side up the mountain of purgatory, you can then leave this earth and you go to level after level of the planets. And every level is a level of greater brightness, of greater closeness to God, of reward for specific virtues, until you come up to as close as human beings can aspire to the face of God, though no man can see God face to face. Now, this is a very tiny universe. The earth is in the center. There's only one world. Hell is below, and heaven above. And man has a fundamental role in a drama. His moral decision depends upon what he chooses. If he chooses one way, good. If he chooses another way, bad. And the man is central to this drama. His activity is important. His moral decisions of tremendous significance. His life is of tremendous significance in this cosmic geography. Now, the moment you have Bruno saying long before this, there are infinitely many universes. This is just one little speck in all the many. The moment you begin then to say the earth is not the center of the universe, but one of an infinite number in which life could be duplicated, etc., then the role of moral choice is not the central feature of a cosmic drama, like, separating the sheep of the goats in the day of judgment, or going down or going up. The role of man is a career of human beings on one tiny speck, fooling themselves perhaps, or taking themselves self-importantly, or suffering, or doing all the rest in something which is not cosmically central, which God is not vitally concerned as man being the central feature of his creation. And the moment, therefore, cosmologically, in the first instrument which was invented, the first scientific instrument which was invented as a theoretically scientific instrument, was the telescope. You see, it has no practical purpose. I do not mean by that people didn't have scientific instruments before the telescope. Surgeons had tools, but they were for doing certain things, for letting blood. People had mathematical counters, but they were for doing certain things. People had measuring rods and levers, but they were all connected with technology. Telescope had no practical use at all. Could tell you that the motions then, as in the 20th century, could tell you the motions on the other side of the moon seemed similar to the motions on this side of the moon, but no practical use at all. In that sense, it was the birth of the scientific genius. The recognition you want to discover what the world is like because it's there, because it's a challenge to your curiosity, and not because it will help you decide what you ought to do, whether to go to heaven or whether to go to hell. And the result is a whole change in man's image of himself. Whole change. The one hand, of course, he's going to get new confidence in reason, new confidence in his ability to understand the world. But on the other hand, the whole picture I mentioned a moment ago, the earth is the center, Jerusalem is the center of that. The degrees of cold decided not by some abstract meteorological laws, but by closeness to hell. The degrees of light decided by the moral virtue which is associated with each planet. The whole cosmological picture vanishes. Donne, the English metaphysical poet, was so similar to in some of his tones to the religious poet who died last week, T.S. Eliot, speaks of this period as all coherence gone, one of his famous poems. The earth is not the center, everything is out of joint, and all coherence gone. That sort of coherence which the religious vision gave. More dramatically, Pascal, of whom I'll speak in a moment, speaks of this as the vast silence of the infinite spaces frightens me. The recognition that man is alone and frightened in a huge stellar space, and therefore the religious picture just was egocentrically centered. Put the earth as the center and everything located anthropomorphically and anthropocentrically in terms of man's estate. Now let me see what's the point of what I'm saying. The point of what I'm saying is that a religion which could adequately suggest a morality for man when what was at stake was recognizing his moral choice as central to his career in a universe in which God had made him the object of his affection and concern, simply ceases to function in a universe which has this scientific expansion, this scientific inflation. And this is one of the impacts of 17th century science. A second, and perhaps for reason of time, I'll just mention the second as the most important, is the whole recognition that value judgments, judgments of what ought to be, which were derived from religion, are related to judgments of what is the case, what is human nature like. And the whole conception of human nature changes as a result of the impact of science. The new physiology, the new study of the senses, the new study of the nature of man suggest certain qualities about man, certain attempt to develop your ethics from understanding man as a person who is guided by pleasure and pain in one case, in Spinoza's case, or in Hobbes's case, or as a person who is guided by a desire to gratify and seek for happiness, to a great extent in Descartes' case. In any event, they try to understand man as a natural animal, to use a phrase which is popular centuries later, not as a fallen angel, but as a risen ape. And this recognition that our value judgments are derived from our account of human nature, and that our human nature depends upon our scientific account of man, somehow suggests that the religious morality, which is based upon interpretation of man as a body soul or as a different sort of being than the picture science gives to us of him, is mistaken. And so I suggest the second great area of challenge of the adequacy of religion for ethics is derived from the scientific revolution in two ways. Firstly, simply in expanding the scope of the universe so that man's place ceases to be the central moral drama of the universe. And secondly, in giving us an account of nature, and more particularly of human nature, which is different from the account of human nature which the religions gave, and to that extent, to the extent to which our moral judgments depend upon our account of human nature, our moral judgments will shift, and the religious basis will not be adequate from this point of view. Now, this was the second. Let me suggest a third way in which the adequacy of religion for moral behavior was challenged. This third way is the discovery and great emphasis upon comparative religion. The discovery that so many different moral codes existed in such a variety of human religious experience. And when one were to say there is a religious justification for morality, then the obvious challenge is which religious justification for morality given the institution of comparative religions? Are you going to say the ideal of virginity, if that is the ideal, let's say, in Christian religion, and monogamy, which presumably came with it, with certain chastity and so on? Or are you going to say the ideal of polygamy in Islamic religion, Bedouin Islamic religion anyway? Or are you going to say something else? Are you going to say the ideal, as I said a moment ago, of reverence for life in certain types of Indian religions, which even at the price of the destruction of human life, the sacred monkeys or the sacred cows, which cannot be killed even though human life suffers? Or are you going to say the opposite? Are you going to say tremendous concern with human life above all, which occurs in other historical religions? Are you going to say a variety of concerns for the downtrodden, which occurs in prophetic biblical religion, let's say? Or are you going to say a concern for caste status, which occurs in a variety of Hindu religions? Which religious truth is sanctioned? Now you could say, all the other religions are false, but the one I choose. But the moment you're aware that there are hundreds of billions and billions of people, and the religions have very fundamental similarities derived from certain fundamental human motivations, whether of desire for continuity of family, or of psychological stress, or of reduction of anxiety in a hostile universe, whatever the account you give. The moment you see the similarities, that the prophet Cassandra is not that different in some ways from the prophet Jeremiah, you are struck with the thought, can I really say and mean it that the accident of my birth in this religion makes it the true one and all the others false? And the moment you say, what? No, it doesn't, then where is the religious justification? If there's a religious justification for polygamy and a religious justification for monogamy, there's a justification for both, then there is no religious justification at all. You cannot justify contradictories. You must justify only one. Now you could say, the other religions are false and mine is the true one. But faced with a situation where they will say the same, and where you're aware of the differences and aware of the similarities, the transparency. It's not that this is an argument that's false. The other religions could be false. It's not, that this is an argument which is necessarily convincing logically. The other religions could be false and yours could be true. But still, faced with the variety of religious experience, the variety of human religions, the sheer awareness of the diversity, the sheer awareness of their contradictoriness suggested historically and suggests today the inadequacy of a religious justification. Let me just explain why I said the argument isn't convincing logically. Assume there's a culture, an Australian culture, the Maoris, who count 1, 2, 3 and many. 1, 2, 3 and many. And you say to them, what are 2 and 2? And they say many. And what are 3 and 3? And they say many. You say, are 2 and 2 the same as 3 and 3? And they say, yes, that's right. I don't think you go away saying, the Maoris have a very interesting mathematics. It's not as good as our mathematics, because they can't tell the difference between 3 and 3 being 6 and 2 being 4. But it has a lot of other good points to it. It isn't very complicated. And for the discrete particulars, it works. And the moment you start talking about amorphous numbers, which don't mean anything anyway, they just call it all many. And there are lots of operations they can do. It's their style. You have your mathematical style. They have their mathematical style. Their mathematical style isn't as rich as yours, but it doesn't make mistakes. Your mathematical style is richer. Maybe you make more mistakes. It's just a difference of styles. They like to wear one style of hat. You like to wear another style of hat. If the Maoris dress, I don't know how they dress, but as a matter of fact, but let's assume they dress in simple, very simple clothes made of homegrown plants. I don't think anyone would say that their dress is false and our dress is true, or vice versa. Well, their mathematics is their style, our mathematics is our style. So you might say, and I think you would be mistaken, you would simply have to say, the Maoris are very interesting people. They dress nicely, they're very brave people. One thing they don't know, they don't have any good mathematics. They count 1, 2, 3 and many, and that's not the best way to count. Now we might say the same thing in religion. The Aztecs, when the conquistadores visited them and they tortured them, very often in the Inquisition, they said, you know, they have a terrible religion. It's a bloodthirsty religion. I remember this one of the things which really struck me in reading Diaz, the story of the conquest of Mexico. And he describes how a hug had quartered a Aztec, and he says, you know, it's a terrible religion. They believe in human sacrifice. And he isn't self-conscious that they are at the same time quartering the man, that is to say, cutting him up as they hang him. And yet, he says, he has no doubt at all, his religion is the true one, theirs is the false one. But the moment you read this and you say, yes, but isn't it more correct to suggest doubts on the truth or falsity of religion? The moment you're aware of the diversity of religions, the adequacy seems to crumble. Now, of course, there's one other reply here, other than your religion is true and the others are false. It's to insist that there is a kernel which all religions share, and that this is the religious justification. But usually the discovery of this kernel appeals, this common core, appeals not to our sense of religion, but appeals to our independent sense of moral autonomy. At any rate, it seems to me that's an interesting question I can leave open. I can't think of any such kernel. I can't think of any kernel which one could say all religions share, without, of course, having to exclude some religions as false, religions which have as good ground to be considered true as another one. I have said that I'm going to review. Let me just summarize a moment. I began with an account of the adequacy of religion in a variety of domains of human experience. I suggested how it functioned as levels of aspiration and of inhibition, of expressiveness, of release, of scientific curiosity, and of moral guidance, historically, for hundreds and thousands of years in a variety of cultures. Then I looked at the Western tradition, and I said, what arose within the history of Western tradition that raises difficulties? And I'm summarizing 5 difficulties. The first was the internal difficulty, already implicit in the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, that although religiously the good is equivalent to, or is defined as, the command of God, even within the religious tradition, we tend to say, not that everything which God commanded is good, but only that some things which are good are commanded by God. Secondly, the difficulty of science. The rise of modern science with its tremendous impact upon 2 aspects of historical religion. Firstly, their picture of the universe as the moral drama for man as the central actor in the universe. And secondly, their conception of human nature as a biophysiological human nature and the impact of that upon the moral values of religion. Thirdly, I suggested the difficulty occasioned by comparative religion, the simple awareness that religions have justified so many contradictory patterns of behavior that to speak of a single justification is almost impossible. I don't say necessarily impossible. I've suggested certain ways in which it could be possible. You would have to say which is the true religion and which are false, or you would have to say which is the common core of all religions, and then you could do it despite the comparative plethora, comparative variety of different religions. Fourthly, I don't know how much is new in this 4th point, but it's in one of the most interesting formulations. It's a small pamphlet which Freud wrote in 1927 called The Future of an Illusion, in which he gave in effect what he thought were the psychological arguments against the adequacy of religion. This is a very, very interesting pamphlet because in this small essay, Freud speaks a great deal of the adequacy of religion, and he does it in the following way. He defines religious belief as essentially illusion. And then he's very vague on defining illusion, except he says the following: I do not mean by illusion the same thing as delusion. An illusion is not necessarily mistaken. A person can have an illusion. He gives illustration. A girl can believe she'll marry Prince Charming, a prince. This might be a delusion, might be some sort of paranoid experience. But it might simply be an illusion. It may not be false. She may really marry Prince Charming. Is it illusory? Is it delusory? He says, illusions are sometimes delusions. They are sometimes false, but not always so. Columbus believed that he would find a way to China. This, he says, to India, China, and Japan. This, Freud says, is an illusion, but not necessarily a false one. I understand what? That there is a way, if you go very carefully through the Northwest Passage in Canada, was first done by Raoul de Manson in 1905. to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific by boat. And a few years ago, the Canadian icebreaker ship, Majesty's Canadian ship Labrador, did it. So it can be done. So Columbus was not deluded that if you sailed from Portugal, he would hit Japan or China without a Panama Canal. But Freud calls that an illusion because he says the element of wishful thinking, the element of believing that it's so, is crucial, not the element of realistic appraisal of the fact. And in general, he says, wherever there's an element of wishfulness, of desire to go beyond what the facts say, to believe on the basis of insufficient evidence because one wishes something or one wills something, he calls that illusions. And then he says illusions are, of course, not necessarily bad. In fact, of course, he believes that religion is illusion, which historically has been absolutely necessary. He says, for example, take primitive life. Take the total chaos which man must have been subjected to without any rational account of why it lightnings, why it thunders, why it rains, why earthquakes come. And assume you have a coherent account. Whatever be the coherent account. It lightnings and thunders because the gods are angry, but if you are good, it will not lightning and thunder. It earthquakes because you have violated these and these laws, but if you will obey these laws, it will not. The moment then you get some perspective, some point of view toward the terrors of nature. And Freud says the anxieties of the terrors of nature, without any science, would have been so overwhelming that man could not have borne life had he not developed these illusions about their control and amenability through prayer, through dance, through ritual. And therefore, if religion is an illusion, it's an illusion which reduces human anxiety and allows him to come to terms with the terrors of life. Indeed, Freud defines 3 sorts of terrors or fears or anxieties to which the religious illusion has served as a sort of antidote. The first are the terrors of nature to which I referred. And the illusion exorcises, that's his phrase in this case, exorcises, banishes, wipes away the terrors of nature because it gives nature a certain coherent structure. This is, of course, to refer to what I said before, Pascal meant when he said, or done, that in the world as man as a flat place with the heavens above and hell below, they could understand it was coherent, and the vast silence of the infinite spaces frightened. And for primitive man, with lightning, with earthquake, with avalanche, with other such things, the coherence of nature was given by the illusion of religious control. Secondly, Freud says the terror of death. No man is free in his view of this fear of death. No one can totally banish it. And religion offered an illusion about the fear of death, sometimes in straight afterlife stories, sometimes in surrogate immortality, living through one's people or one's religion, sometimes in a variety of other activities, ritualistic practices which give one some surcease when death comes. Whatever be the reduction of anxiety which the religious illusion gives against terrors of nature, it also serves against terrors of mortality. And thirdly, he said, of course, and against that whole source of human hatred and anxiety which is inflicted by man upon man. It gives you some sort of recognition about the nature of man, who of course always creates cruelty to man, and to that extent a religious illusion gives you some sort of account of why men are cruel to men. They will be punished for doing it in one case, or they will be forgiven, or you must forgive them. Whatever the moral status or moral condition is, and it varies from religion to religion, Freud says, in every case, faced with the cruelty of man to man, faced with the terrors of nature, faced with the fear of death, the religious illusion serves to reduce human anxiety and make life bearable. This seems like a very, very strong case for the illusion. But, Freud continues to say, but the very fact, and Freud makes the case even stronger, if I might say so, Freud makes the case even stronger by granting that these 3 sorts of terror, no matter how much science progresses in his view, are absolutely ultimate. There always will be some degree of terror in nature, whether you have weather prediction, weather control, there'll always be, in Freud's view, and I think this is undoubtedly true, an element of terror in nature for the human species, unavoidable domination by natural phenomena. No matter what the progress of medicine will be, here he has a little bit of skepticism. He cautious just about, but he says they will never overcome death and therefore the fear of death. And thirdly, he sees no possibility of ever overcoming totally those aggressive or frustrated instincts in man which make for infliction of pain of one man upon another man. And therefore there's always need for this illusion in a world of this sort. And yet he says, he concludes, that the very recognition that it is an illusion should make one want to outgrow it. The very recognition that it doesn't rest upon a realistic assessment of what the human situation should make the rational man want to say, I do not want the illusion. This is good for an infant. When I was a child, let me think as a child. But for a human being, I must say, these are the terrors of nature. They are not controllable by gods or man. I have to live with them. This, in some sense, is an end to an illusion. This is death. I cannot overcome it, sir, this way. Must accept it as a fact of nature with whatever picture it gives. Now, interestingly enough, the very structuring of the category by which Freud allows realism to operate suggests a different sort of coming to terms with these terrors, which would, on his terms, be in itself an illusion. But Freud suggests that the religious illusion is notoriously the one of wishful thinking and therefore the infantile one, and the important thing is to overcome it. And to the extent to which he gives us a psychiatric analysis of the motivation for religious belief, he suggests a certain skepticism regarding the adequacy of religious belief for moral justification of human activity. Lastly, and much less excitingly, I just want to mention a logical point, which is fatal perhaps to lots of other positions beside the religious adequacy of moral justification. But let me go back to our problem. Our problem was, in explaining this, our problem was that human beings have different moral commitments. Let's take one, thou shalt not kill. And another one, of course, says you can kill if the man has committed murder, capital punishment. Another one says, no, you can't kill if he's committed murder, absolutely no capital punishment. Moral commitment says you can kill if what? If it's a case of war. And a religious pacifist will, of course, say, my religion forbids me to kill even in a case of war, and so on and so forth. And then the question becomes, what is the religious justification? And usually we appeal to arguments to give the justification. Even the religious argument appeals to arguments of fact. It suggests, for example, that man is made in this way, let's say created in the image of God, and therefore you ought not to kill a fellow man. And the logical difficulty always is that from arguments of fact, you can never derive directly what ought to be. This is perhaps not the ideal place to explain a logical point, but it's not a very subtle one. Assume I say there's a fire in the school building down the street. It does not follow, when somebody says there's a fire, you ought to put it out. It doesn't follow that there's a fire means you ought to put it out. There's a fire could mean let it burn. Depends what you want, what your preferences, what your values are. The school child may say, there's a fire in the school, let it burn. Do you know that Crassus was one of the three triumvirs? At one time Rome was ruled by Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Crassus was the money of the triumvirate. Pompey was the family, so on, and Caesar, of course, the military and political genius. But Crassus was the bankroll, and one of the sources of Crassus's wealth was that he had the fire department of Rome. And when a building was on fire, and of course he was accused of arson but never proved, when a building was on fire, the fire department would come with the water. It was a private fire department owned by him, and he would begin bargaining to buy the building. And if you met his price, the fire department went into action. And if you didn't, they dawdled around until you did meet his price. And this is a very good way to make money. But it doesn't follow for Crassus, this building is on fire, you ought to put it out. The building is on fire, let it burn till it meets my price. The point I'm making is just a very simple one. It does not follow from the fact that all men are created equal, that they ought to be treated equally. just as it wouldn't follow from the fact that all men are created unequally, which is probably more true, that they ought to be treated unequally. What ought to be doesn't follow from what is. And this is difficulty for religious justification as it is for other types of justification. Now, I've taken a little more time than I wanted, so let me just summarize these 5 points and suggest very quickly some responses and then make a conclusion. The 5 points I was suggesting was the challenge to the adequacy of religion in moral justification, firstly because of the internal difficulty that even within religious justification there's an appeal to one's moral sense. Secondly, because of the conflict with science. Thirdly, because of the sophistication brought about by comparative religion. Fourthly, because of the Freudian argument that an awareness of the motivation of religion in certain sorts of infantile anxieties or genuine anxieties which we meet by infantile illusions. And lastly, this logical point that even if we accept the facts as religion gives us, there's an arbitrariness to its ought judgments, and religious justification cannot escape this arbitrariness. Now, there are answers, I suppose, to each of these points. Good ones, I suppose. In the case, for example, of the scientific challenge, to the extent to which it rests upon a theory that science can give an adequate theory of human nature, I suppose the religious response would be something like, there is nothing to stop religious justification from making use of scientific accounts of human nature. Its function should still be the portrayal of a level of aspiration for man. And this it can perfectly accept, whatever the implications of science are, either regarding the size of the universe or the biological nature of man. Or, for example, take the case of the Freudian case, which is the only one I'll mention since I promised you 20 minutes this time for questions and answers, and if there aren't that many, I can go back and make a few more points. Freud himself suggests, let me just make 2 points here. First, Freud himself suggests there would be nothing wrong with illusions on 2 conditions. First, that they were not delusions. And therefore, it's a very good slogan for a religionist, I think. Illusion without delusion. Very good slogan. Legitimate. We reduce the anxiety, the element of wishful thinking. We reject what is false. Illusion without delusion. And secondly, his argument against them is that they're childish. It's childish. You have to face death. What do you say? Someplace up there where the soul is disembodied, etc. Well, all right. Only mature illusions. Only mature illusions. You're entitled to certain sorts of wishful thinking, but as long as they're mature, they're what a realistic person, knowing the facts of life, could wishfully state to himself in the absence of total evidence, but without falling into childishness or immaturity. Those are reasonably good slogans, and I'm not sure that every single religious belief would fail if those slogans which Freud suggests were applied to them. Illusion without delusion, and only mature illusion. The phenomena of comparative religion are fatal, I suppose, if you want to give an ultimate universal religious justification. But there's nothing stopping you from saying within a particular tradition, within a particular consensus of men, trying to solve a certain set of problems, the religious tradition serves and has served as a historical depository, giving you certain sorts of patterns of activity which work effectively to guide men in these type of solutions. Prophetic religion worked, as institutionalized, reasonably adequately for certain sorts of societies in giving moral guidance. The fact that it wouldn't work in some culture of the Balinese is irrelevant. The Balinese have to use their religion. The adequacy of religion is not denied necessarily in giving norms and guides to areas of human experience if one recognizes either first that it's rooted in the nature of man psychologically, or secondly, that different religions will have different sorts of moral norms and guides, or thirdly, that there is an element of illusion or wishfulness in any attempt to introduce religious justification in morals, to suggest that man can give some sort of guide of what ought to be and what ought not to be, which is other than just the facts of power or the facts of immediate gratification. So I'm suggesting that given these 5 criticisms I've given, there's a back and a forth. There are 2 cases. I've just tried to hint in a few minutes That's some of the backs and forths, some of the responses one would give. In the question period, I hope we could go into that. Let me conclude with the following point. There's a sense in which what we've been talking about is relatively theoretical, as it should be. This is a theoretical course title, a relatively theoretical material. What if we bring it a little more down to earth and ask ourselves the following question? Not how does the religious justification fare against these various arguments, but what ought one to accept it or not, regardless of whether it's true or false, simply in terms of its values. There's a very famous tradition, two various famous theological traditions. In one, you try to prove the existence of God or disprove the existence of God. This is, of course, a very famous theological debate, which no one has ever resolved, presumably. In the other, you don't try to decide whether it's true or false that God exists. You just try to tell the man whether he should believe in him or not, whether it's true or false. Pascal is the best case in here. He says, let's assume we can never solve the answer. Then the question issue is, which ought I to believe? Well, that's like a bet, as Pascal sees it. I don't know which horse will win. Which is the better odds? Can't know which is true, which is false, which will win. Which is the better odds? And then Pascal develops the following famous wager, to wit, what are the odds? Well, let's assume I believe. Well, I could be mistaken. If there is no God and I believe, I could be mistaken. What then would happen? I would have been mistaken. I would have fooled myself throughout my life. I would have believed something that was true, that was false was true. Well, no great loss. Stakes negatively aren't terrible. The loss is I made a fool of myself in terms of my rationality. What do I gain? Well, if it's true, what do I gain if it's true? What do I gain if it's true? He says, I gain great happiness in this life, and in his view, you gain some sort of heaven. All right. What if I'm mistaken? Well, let's just look at the four alternatives. Let me be a little more precise. It could either be true or false, and I could believe or disbelieve. Assume I believe and it's true, that I've gained eternal happiness. Assume I believe and it's false, then I fooled myself. So plus I've got a great plus, and minus I've got a very little minus. Plus I've got great happiness if it's true. If it's false, I fooled myself. It's no great sin. Assume I disbelieve. All right. What do I gain if I win? That is to say, if God doesn't exist and I disbelieve on his bet. I had the right answer. I was right all along. Certain vindication of my rationality. Well, no great gain. What do I miss if I lose? I didn't believe, and then it turns out there is. I lose a fantastic great deal. I lose, on this view, some sort of key to happiness of a transcendent sort. Well, then be a rational man. Be a computing machine, if you will. Minimize, maximize. Which bet ought you to put when the odds are that way? No one knows the answer. Which bet ought you to put? And Pascal, who was very interested in part in theory of probabilities, and obviously mathematical genius, has no doubt. Any rational person, given those odds, very little to gain if you're right in disbelief, very much to lose if you're wrong in disbelief, everything to gain if you're right in belief, very little to lose if you're wrong in belief. We'll choose belief over disbelief. Not a question of does God exist or does God not exist, is it true or false? Question of what ought you to believe. Same question he might be asked here in terms of the search for religious justification. Not can it be done, but ought we somehow to look for it? Ought we somehow to say, I don't think you can have a religious justification because of the reasons I gave. But still, this is what our society needs desperately. This is what we ought to be searching for. Now, here again, it's sort of a question of the gains and risks if you look at it this way. And I think everything depends upon your assessment of the nature of the contemporary crisis. If you believe that, to use that big cliche phrase, the crisis of modern man, if you think that the crisis of modern man is the following. The crisis of modern man is that his technology is tremendously advanced, that his scientific curiosity is tremendously aggressive, and yet his religious humility and his sense of security requires the sort of illusion which religion could give, and his sense of humility and modesty in place requires the sort of landmarks which traditional religion could give, then you would say, I think, even though we couldn't believe, the vital thing is to try to cultivate religious belief so as to avoid disaster. If, on the other hand, you think that the contemporary crisis is the following: great advances in technology, great advances in affluence, great failures to apply scientific knowledge in psychological, economical, and economics, in psychology, in birth control, and other areas, then you say what we need is to get our science working more on our value questions. What we need is much greater concern with the domain of science in the social arena rather than in machine technology, and not a return to religion. Well, there are, of course, very exciting proponents for both sides. The poet who died this week, T.S. Eliot, in one of his famous poems, which I can't quote verbatim, which goes something like, where is the wisdom we have lost in understanding? The therapists give us understanding, we've lost wisdom. Where is the understanding we have lost in knowledge? We don't even have understanding. We have a lot of scientific facts. And therefore, he makes the plea for a search for religious revival, for giving human wisdom. Contrariwise, the greatest American philosopher of this century, Dewey, was the prophet of the belief that the failure wasn't religion. The failure was the failure to apply science not only in domains of atomic physics, but domains of human psychology and sociology and so on. I myself don't know. I used to certainly believe in the Deweyan vision. And yet the very progress of the social sciences seems only to exacerbate the difficulties. So I don't think I have an answer on that particular aspect of the problem. But I do think, of course, there are two questions to be asked. First, can there be a religious justification of values? Secondly, as I've suggested, regardless of that question, in the contemporary situation, what stress ought to be given? And although there are risks and gains in both ways, I've suggested it depends in part upon your interpretation of where we stand in 1965. We stand with a failure of nerve in applying science, then surely we don't want to return to religion. We stand with the Dark Ages returning, to quote Winston Churchill, on the wings of science, then what we need is some sort of enterprise of vitality which can counteract scientific values. Well, I think I'll end here and allow you at least a little while to pose questions on the backs and forths, particularly since next time I go on, don't I, with values in science. Are there questions or comments? Yes. It's a little book. It's a very short book. Freud actually wrote 3 or 4 books on religion, didn't he? Moses' Monotheism was his last. Totem and Taboo was, I think, the first. But the one I was referring to was Future of an Illusion. The Future of an Illusion. It's in paperback for 95 cents. Very nice edition. Yes? No, Pascal believed it did make a difference. He believed whether God was true, whether God existed or not, didn't make a difference. Yeah. Yeah.
Pascal said, well, if you're right, then you're intellectually right. You didn't make a fool out of yourself. It's more than just making a fool out of yourself. It's leading a whole life, a completely different life. So it's based on reason your life or based on religion. It's a totally different type of life.
Yes, yes. I agree with the criticism.
Not weighing the four failures, failing.
Yes.
He's making the next life a great thing, the present life no account.
I think your criticism is a very fair one. I agree with it. Well, you can understand, disagree. Well, let me just read. I use the Pascal illustration, let me say in defense, that I use the Pascal illustration to do what? To show that there are two different questions. A question of truth or falsity and the question of adequacy or inadequacy. And I think that's right. Now, I then, to illustrate it, illustrated Pascal's terms of the wager. And your criticism is, Pascal says, look, the wager is believe or disbelieve, and no one knows the answer. Now, you can either be right or wrong. Let's assume you believe and you're right. Then you've gained a great deal. Let's assume you believe and you're wrong. What have you lost? Very little, he says. You fooled yourself. Big deal. You believed one thing and turned out to be mistaken. Let's assume you disbelieve and you're right and you're wrong. What have you lost? A great deal. Let's assume you disbelieve and you're right. What have you gained? Very little, he says. You had the right answer all along. And this gentleman suggests that Pascal is formulating the wager unfairly and incorrectly. And because he suggests the difference isn't, Pascal, you see, is already formulated from the point of view of a person who weighs the religious values. The difference is, given belief, you're going to structure your life on one set of assumptions, with one set of attitudes. Given disbelief, you're going to structure your life with a different set of attitudes. And it isn't the case that the choice is just if you choose the scientific approach, the choice is just if you're right, big deal. If you choose the scientific approach, there are whole areas of human experience which you will approach differently. And therefore, the wager is different. And Pascal misstates the case. I think that's a fair criticism of Pascal. Obviously, some people are going to disagree.
I just feel that there's too much emphasis on right or wrong. After all, it's right of the majority who says it's right and who says it's wrong. We're trying to say,
Hopefully not just the majority of the minority.
who says it's right and who says it's wrong?
Well, in the case of religious belief, it's of course terribly difficult. It may be impossible to know. Indeed, one of the most famous theories of religious belief is precisely a theory which would say that it's never possible, and I think if I'd got into this in greater detail, and at one point I could have used this, that it never makes sense to speak of religious belief as right or wrong, as true or false. Why? Well, let me be very formally logical a moment in reply to this. Assume I say there is water in this glass. That's either true or false. It seems to me even if most of you, by some sort of hypnotic illusion, didn't believe it, you would be wrong. And the person who said there's water would be right. The same thing, even if there were many, many more Maoris than us, and they say 2 and 2 are 5, and we say 2 and 2 are 4, we're right and they're wrong. But in religious cases, it's difficult for the following reason. Let's take sentences like, hurrah for the Y. Somebody says boo for the Y. Somebody says hurrah for Columbia. Somebody says hurrah for Yale. Somebody says, is hurrah for Columbia right or is hurrah for Yale right? You say, you missed the point. It isn't like the sentence 2 and 2 is 4. It's either right or wrong, true or false. Or there's glass in here. It's right or wrong, true or false. Hurrah for so-and-so. That's not a statement that's right or wrong, true or false. That's a statement that's expressive of an emotion, directive of an attitude, a release for emotion, etc. And the claim that the Pascalians usually follow up this position with, the claim which I alluded to at the beginning in discussing the adequacy or inadequacy of religion in these domains, is precisely this, namely, that religious belief is not a question of truth or falsity at all. One person is saying, not God exists is true, but one is saying hurrah for it, one is saying boo for it. There's no way of knowing right or wrong. That isn't the issue. But even so, your criticism, if I may argue your case for a moment in this, would stand. You would say, but it makes a tremendous difference whether you say hurrah for it or boo for it. It isn't just that you lose one way and win another way. It's that you have different ways of life. Yes, I don't know. First.
And if it hasn't changed, so why isn't that what Freud says, again an illusion that logic and science would change human nature?
Well, I guess part of the question would rest on what you mean by change human nature. In one sense, I suppose the answer is no, in the sense that, I don't know, Homo sapiens biologically, and so on and so forth, is similar, same sorts of fears and terrors, etc. In another sense, I think the answer is very definitely yes, and we would all agree. And we'd be caught here in a verbal quarrel of how much of a change is a change. Because look, the human nature of the religious thug, to take an extreme religion, a religion which believed in religious expression through strangling, was a different sort of human nature than the human nature of a Buddhist in the same country of India. The human nature of an Orthodox Jewish Chassid in Buchach or some such town is certainly a different human nature in a variety of ways than the human nature of his grandson in New York City. And to that extent, religious belief and religious disbelief changed. I say, not really. But how much is the difference? Yes, of course, not really. But how much difference has to be a difference? One, when faced with this choice, chose one way. One, when faced with another, didn't. One has a divorce rate of this and this sort. One a divorce rate of this and this sort. One has 11 children in his family and suffers for the children. One has 2 children. One has this and this rate of alcoholism, one of another. How much change is required for there to be a change? I think religion has changed human nature, like many institutions have, science has, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The issue partly is there any way of guaranteeing that a true religion would change it always for better? And part of my skepticism has been not. Yes, sir.
We have an instance in history where we had a system of values, which then took on all the incidents and indicia of a religion. I'm referring now to Confucianism. Great teacher, and over the centuries you had a system of worship, temples, uniforms, and so forth and so on. And these people don't necessarily talk about God. He said himself, I don't know about God at all. And yet all the other indicia of religion pertain to Confucianism today.
Yes, if you introduce non-theistic religions, I'm not sure whether Confucianism is or isn't, or whether Buddhism is or isn't, but there are some, and introduce religions whose essence appears to be totally a moral code without other things, then you would complicate the waters for us very much. But I think we'd be on pretty good ground if we stick with the major historical religions that we're familiar with and see how the problem of religious justification of ethics functions in them. Because the difficulty you suggest is really stated by me, even within the religions I referred to, when I said they are in a dilemma in the relationship between the religious component and the ethical component of their ethical autonomy component within their own system. I think I'll get him first. Yes? I'll give him a minute. Well, there are 2 questions there. As to the first, the definition, I didn't give a formal definition, nor do I think it would help us. I did define ostensibly by pointing to cases, and I meant institutional religions of the Western tradition. Not all, I think, father religions. Some of them could be matriarchal. I mentioned Aztec religion. I'm not sure it's a father religion. Some people would give you an argument on aspects of Christianity being matriarchal religion. But I grant you your point. Now, as to the 2 exceptions, my answer would be on Spinoza. If I'd had more time, I would have tried to treat him as the prophet of science, so to speak, as not a religious figure. And in the case of Marxism, I did try to discuss those theories, quasi-religious, if you will, theological in some cases, secular in the Marxist case, which tried to give ultimate justification through history last week. I don't know whether you're here. In that sense, the phrase about Marxism, the book I quoted, was the God that failed, but still Marxism is a special case that I did treat in terms of the historicist answer, and indeed in terms of science, I'm going to treat the Spinozist case. If there are other sort of borderline instances, I don't think we need worry too much about them, but we have a fairly good intuitive notion of the historical cases. Now, is the ethical sense reducible to the religious sense? Not unless you, I think, beg the question. Because, look, if you say it is, then an atheist could not be ethical. What do you do with the problem of the ethical atheist? If you say all the religious sense is identical with the ethical sense, what do you do with the problem of the ethical atheist? What you say is, he doesn't know it, but he's really religious. And when Rydell Niebuhr debated Sidney Hook, that was his answer. You're really religious. Well, then what does religious mean? It means you're ethical. Well, that begs the question. Let me give an illustration. Somebody says, all the bright students are the popular students. You say that's absurd. I went through the list of all the magna cum laude graduates. They didn't belong to a single society. They weren't elected to a single office. He says, I wasn't talking about the grinds. I was talking about the bright students, those students who get good grades and are active. Surely all the bright students are the popular students, if you mean by bright, popular, and gets good grades. And the same thing here. All the ethical activities are religious, and all religious are ethical, if you mean by religion ethics, and if you mean by ethics religion. But if you give independent definitions, as you do when you speak of a man being an ethical atheist, then I do not see that the religious sense and the ethical sense are identical. The very fact that we can formulate the question, when God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, was it a moral command, means that we distinguish between the religious command of God and the moral evaluation of the command. Perhaps there's time for one more question. Yes? Is it, pardon?
The moral evaluation. It's always man's evaluation of things. It has nothing to do with God.
Well, the argument, of course, would be in religious belief, wouldn't it, that just as when a man says 2 and 2 is 4, it's man's mathematics. But man here is not inventing it, he's discovering what is the structure of some prior reality. When man says there are 102 elements, it's man's invention. He named the 102nd one Americium. But the answer is he's not inventing, he's discovering what the nature of the universe is. Now, the religionist's argument, I'm not urging you to accept it or reject it here, is identical. When he says there's a moral law, thou shalt not kill, he says man said it, but man was not inventing, he was discovering the moral law. And the question of the religious justification is exactly that question. Does man invent or does man discover these laws? And I've suggested reasons why religions have believed he discovered them, perhaps not explicit reasons, and I've also suggested reasons why people would suggest he invented them.
God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son, and supposing the man was stopped his hand, wasn't it a human decision?
Well, it depends. Well, now, what do you want me to say? From my point of view, or from the point of view of the author of the story in the Bible? From the point of view of the author of the story in the Bible, it was God who pointed out the ram to Abraham and provided. Yes, it's a test, yes. Yes, last question.
If I believe I have a great deal to gain, right?
Yes, on Pascal's view, yes.
That presupposes quite a value or a set of values by which I would live.
Yes.
Now, that also, of course, is what the Western world is supposed to be doing because the Western world believes it has accepted what we call religion. And it has something to lean on, but it doesn't live.
Yes, well, I think there are two questions here. One is there is, of course, a big gap between the theory between theory and practice, I think, in every code. And to the extent to which you point out, I surely agree with you. The other is, to some extent, our own moral code is now a melange. That's why this lecture series is possible. If we had a single moral code which was decisive, we wouldn't have this lecture series. But it's precisely because our moral values are derived partly from social action like last week, from religious tradition like this week, from scientific knowledge, or from concern with creativity. It's precisely because we pay a lip service to all these things, not just to one thing, that our values don't just reflect religious values. To that extent, we have, of course, in every case, the gap between theory and practice, but here it's accentuated because we have plural, not a single norm. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.